Intro. Let's go ahead and introduce our panelist here. First up, we have Alan Zimbalist, who is a senior managing engineer here at Fairdinkum. And we also have John Iacono, partner and chief managing engineer at Fairdinkum. And then we also have our special guest, Eric Fiske, who is co-founder of Hacket Cyber, a company that's dedicated to the art of cybersecurity testing and experience in utilization of kind of doing all of the cybersecurity tests and partnership with Fairdinkum to go ahead and go over some of these very tests we're going to be talking about today. Basically, our overall goal here is to have you guys leave this webinar with a bit more education on the subject and kind of feel comfortable discussing cybersecurity standards and potentially ideas of tests that we should be putting in place at your company. So I guess jumping right in here, let's start out with vulnerability scans. John, if you don't mind, taking this one here, would you be able to explain a little bit more about what a vulnerability scan is, what it checks for, potentially how often businesses might like to have scans done?
Sure. So vulnerability scan is a scan that's run across the network to check for any kind of known vulnerabilities. So any potential exploits on devices like laptops or desktops or network devices, etc. These scans can be run either by a third party or using third-party tools or by a managed service provider themselves. Typically, nowadays, what we like to see is a continuous vulnerability scan. So there's agents or software that sits on devices and continuously scans for any kind of vulnerabilities and really transmits that data back to kind of a mothership server that then creates reports on vulnerabilities that are found. But the vulnerability scans can also be done on less constant basis, so quarterly or weekly, even monthly. It all really depends on budgeting and also how many devices are within the system itself. That's really kind of the long and short of a vulnerability scan from a top level. So you're really looking for known vulnerabilities, and then that'll give your IT kind of a checklist to go through to then resolve those found vulnerabilities.
And then what are some vulnerabilities that we might be able to see kind of come up? Like what are some examples that we might see?
Yeah. So the biggest vulnerabilities that we'll see are going to be outdated software. So software that's missing patches that are available that close up any kind of security holes. So it might be vulnerable programming within that software or, something that's found that there is a fix for. So patches are really the big thing that comes up on those.
Was there anything, any other insight, Eric or Alan, that we feel like we kind of missed there? Or
No, I think that kind of hits it. I mean, vulnerability scanning itself is kind of essential for most organizations. And a lot of people look at it probably from a Microsoft perspective, right? Like, oh, I only care about my computers to be updated there, but there's so many tools and software that's being installed. So it's kind of hard to understand, like from third-party apps, if everything's being updated accordingly. So this is kind of a nice health check for most organizations to kind of go through and make sure that they're not missing devices. Everything's connected to the domain accordingly. It just kind of gives them a good warm and fuzzy that they're doing a good job keeping their machines up to date.
Yeah, it goes beyond the Windows updates. It's vulnerabilities, as everybody is saying, in other hardware and software that's on those machines and on the network, and very useful.
Honestly, also, it does catch things that are sometimes forgotten about. For example, if there is an older FTP system set up and it's no longer used, in that vulnerability, they'll come up on there, and then that'll just make sure that we're keeping up to date on, or your IT vendor is keeping up to date on closing anything that's no longer needed.
Yeah, and there is a difference in level of testing too. From John's perspective, where he says an agent's installed on the computer, at that point, it's an authenticated scan. So it's actually going one level deeper. You can do an unauthenticated scan of a device, look for just an outside view of it and understand like what remote code execution vulnerabilities can take advantage of a device. But when you dive into that machine, you start scanning everything from a user level. You start to see a lot more of the attack surface open up there. So it's very important to kind of make sure you dive down as deep as you can with those.
okay, and so this almost seems like vulnerabilities are kind of checking for active things that are already on the network just to kind of see, oh, hey, there is a potential hole here or a known risk essentially that we should either like take a look at, or just a simple, like, we're finding something here, let's go ahead and kind of get it like fixed up, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
for sure.
exactly. I would say just, with hardware and software, it's a constant cycle of vulnerabilities being discovered, and then the manufacturers release patches and fixes for those vulnerabilities, and then there's attempted exploitation of those vulnerabilities by malicious actors. So it's a continuous process of you're never fully updated, or you can be fully updated, but there's always more. It's kind of a merry-go-round.
So kind of now pivoting from vulnerability scans, pen testing, sort of in the same realm of cybersecurity, but slightly different. Eric, kind of being the expert on some of these penetration tests. What are penetration tests? Some of the main things that might be checked, and I guess how are they different? How should they be looked at differently than a vulnerability scan?
Well, a lot of the times when we do a scoping call with the customer, they're like, yeah, we want to do a pen test, but we don't need a vulnerability scan. It's like, no, you kind of need both hand in hand, right? So vulnerability scanning itself kind of is leveraged during pen testing. So what ends up happening is we're going to scan an entire network. We're going to look for what we call an initial compromise, right? The goal is to find all exploitable vulnerabilities and attack paths that could lead to compromising users, sensitive data, machines, and devices, right? A vulnerability scan itself is going to highlight possible vulnerabilities that exist on the network. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't do the manual efforts of diving down deep and showing you the lateral movement techniques that attackers are leveraging today. It doesn't show you if you can evade their EDR systems, or if, they have a device that's set up like CrowdStrike or Sentinel-1. Is it going to self-isolate the host if a code is ran on the machine, if somebody's doing something nefarious, right? So that's really kind of what a pen test is going to highlight, a number of those manual techniques that are missing, right? Also, user permissions. You can look at a machine all day and see what patches aren't there, but you can't look into Active Directory really and determine what user might have the unnecessary permissions. The interesting stories we come across are some organization would say, I just recently had a breach that occurred, and we know how it happened. The receptionist got hacked. She gave away her password, but we had ransomware go across the entire network. It's like, let's step back a couple steps there. How did the receptionist's password get that far down your network, right? Shouldn't that be a problem that you should start to try to unravel in your head? Like, she should only have unnecessary permissions to her one machine. How did she get from her machine to compromise your network? So that's kind of how a pen test is going to unravel and give you a good understanding on your network.
So it seems like a pen test is kind of like those active testing, right? Where it's like you're saying, you find those things, or you're actively looking in Active Directory, if they have a domain as an example, and you're trying to get at those exploits, right?
Yeah, exactly. So you're going to utilize, like, from example of a high level from Hackett perspective, the way we start our assessments is we do it from a blind with no credentials. And then from there, our goal is to try to find what we call initial compromise so we can gain access to a machine. And then from that point, we then see if we can actually get a level set of permissions, whether that's a domain user, a service account, or even the administrative account to the device. And then we start to figure out how far can we go with that information, right? Can we laterally move across the network because there's a shared local account across multiple machines? Can we find a user that has administrative rights to their device or other machines on the network because it's accidentally added to a security group when it shouldn't have been, or given the wrong permissions of some kind, right? And then from that point of view, it's really just kind of like showing people the kill chain of how you can actually couple techniques together to how far it can lead to compromising the network, and then giving them an understanding of if X, Y, and Z was in place, this wouldn't have happened.
It's a fine line between essentially ethical hacking, right? Because you're going in there and you're kind of telling this company, I'm going to try to compromise accounts. So I guess who is it that we should be looking out for to run these pen tests, or I guess this ethical hacking? Is there any like certifications, or how do we make sure that this is all done like in agreement with the company itself?
Well, normally there's a scoping call. We provide a statement of work. The statement of work kind of explains the T's and C's for an actual assessment. Some things we usually kind of are a little leery about. We've seen organizations where, like, yeah, we have all of our pen testers are over in Russia and they're going to do all the work for you. It's like, you know, you kind of want to make sure your pen testers are local based, right? Not saying that they don't know what they're doing over there, but just wanting to make sure that, you know, you have some control over who's doing the assessment. If you're more concerned about like what kind of activities are going to occur, like for us, when we talk about a lot of these assessments, when we get on our kickoff call with our customers, the goal is to explain to them, we're not going to try to impede or hinder any daily operations, right? So if we know that you're using some kind of EDR, XDR, like CrowdStrike, SentinelOne, that does self-host isolation in the current of an event, then at that point, we're going to set up some kind of a specific timeline where we can run those kind of tests and control the effort. So that way they have their team available on hand to go ahead and say, okay, hey, we're going to, watch, monitor. If you take something offline, we can put it back up. The last thing you want to do is just kind of run them a little bit crazy, and then all of a sudden half the production goes down and they can't work, and then wake up to a nice fun morning of trying to get everything back online. So that's one step, right? So effective communication, we've seen it across the board from multiple organizations. Some people, for example, have MSPs like yourself, who will, be pretty much the maintenance of all their network. And so they don't have really any technical staff at that point. So it's kind of hard. So usually in those environments, it's going to be like the COO or the CFO that you're going to be communicating with, but also through the MSP partners as well, kind of driving the engagement. So the people who understand like what IPs are in scope, what devices are there, how the network's laid out, those are the people you want to kind of communicate with.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the big things as well, kind of being on myself on the engineering side, having conversations with you of you're able to also test these items. And then if your MSP is doing the correct thing, they're probably getting some sort of notification of, hey, there's something on the network that's happening. And so the objective of the MSP that at that point in time, let's notify the who's ever doing the testing, and let's make sure that they are in fact doing the correct testing, and either let them know, hey, this is impacting businesses or some sort of way, or also saying, hey, we are seeing you there. So it is a good job that whatever we have in place is kind of catching the movement or the testing or the changes that you're kind of like looking into. So it's kind of like that hand in hand, like let's have an agreement on a timeline, and then just be effective together.
Yeah, exactly that. It's very important because as you start testing the network and the environment, you want to make sure that you already have a good understanding when you kind of walking into it, what they have in place. If you don't, what ends up happening is all of a sudden someone's going to call you up and like, my printer's shooting paper everywhere. Like I understand. Okay, so there's a lot of things that can go wrong, but for the most part, when you have seasoned professionals that do this day in and day out, I mean, there's mitigating controls and concerns that you can take the necessary steps to pretty much prevent anybody from having the issue. But you can't fix is some 1970s switch in the closet that's like literally at 99% resource based, and you start pinging the network and it drops the entire thing. You can't fix that. That's some issues where you got to go back and you got to fix your network on one side. But those are all things that are great to find during the assessment, but it's also unfortunate that sometimes that 99% of the time something can still go wrong.
Yeah, and that's the beauty of testing. Alan, John, did you guys have anything to add as well to the pen test, or is that pretty much covered?
That's
I
pretty
would.
much.
Oh,
Sorry, go ahead, Alan.
yeah, I just wanted to add to what Eric was saying there. I've worked with a lot of companies and pen tests over the years, and in my experiences, they have been non-disruptive. Nothing has gone down. No one, no users have had any issues. So of course there is potential out there, but in the reality of the numerous ones I've seen, they've all been non-disruptive.
Yeah, and I just wanted to highlight a point that James made about, a lot of times with pen testing, we think about the vulnerability finding and the ability to exploit vulnerabilities on that pen test. But I think sometimes we lose sight of it also is a good chance for us to test our protection systems as well. Is our is our IDS working? Is our, our alertings all up to date? Is it the notifications being sent to the right person? So not only testing, the failings of a network, but also testing the protection at the same time through a pen test.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, most pen tests, I mean, organizations, a lot of them aren't ready for like red team engagements. As you know, it's really tough to kind of like not know that if you're mature in that environment to see that you already have all the necessary places and devices in place. But most organizations can also still, benefit from flavors of red teaming. So having these assessments performed can definitely check those compensating controls that are in place that people spent tons of money on. I mean, I've seen carbon black without a checkbox, was pretty much a paperweight, right? So
Right.
there's a number of things that can go wrong. So you want to make sure that all that's been put in place. And it's nice to do that from a controlled environment test, right? So
As we can see overall, between vulnerability scans, pen testing, we're just covering a wide range here that kind of isn't under the normal scope of work for general IT because it is getting in there and it's kind of just essentially testing out what your IT company or your MSP like has in place itself, right? Alan, I know you kind of had some insight here. So can you speak a little bit to the cost versus benefit analysis of, are these security measures that are worth it because they do come at this additional cost of time and money to a business?
Yeah, definitely. So, the question comes up, should I do it? It's too expensive. What's the cost of conducting this sort of testing? And then the conversation is also, well, what's the cost of not doing it, right? Um, the companies I work with get asked all the time if they conduct vulnerability scanning and penetration testing, whether it's from due diligence, on themselves or audits or other kind of risk assessment reviews. Um, what I've seen is that vulnerability scanning and penetration testing has become pretty much a standard expectation. Um, Similarly to how EDR and MDR used to be kind of out of reach for small businesses, and now it's a general expectation. So some of the costs that may be involved if you do not do this type of testing, depending on your business, there might be some regulatory or compliance fines or issues. Um, a lot of times the cyber insurance coverage is denied or is very expensive if you're not doing this. And back to the due diligence, some customers and businesses are not going to want to do business with you if you do not adequately protect their information. And on top of all that, if you actually have an incident or some type of breach, you are possibly looking at significant downtime of your systems. So right there, you've just got your loss of business and lost revenue, a lot of interruption. You may have potential legal action from your clients or others affected, depending on what kind of incident there was. And then you're also on the hook for always reporting, in the future, yes, we've had an incident and this and that. So there really are a lot of costs and risks with not doing this as well. And it's really just comes down to the cost benefit analysis of each firm. But our recommendation is certainly to implement this and put it in the evolution of your cyber program if it's not already.
Yeah, because like we were saying as well, so this one it's something that you can say, hey, we are serious about the security and this day and age of we're aware that attacks happen. Let's not, sweep that under the rug and pretend that, oh, it's never going to be us. It's a way a company could say, we take it seriously, whether you're hosting data or emails locally or anything from like another company, you could say, we do, testing, whether it be pen test annually or biannually, vulnerability scans. Essentially, they can be weekly, monthly. Those are a little bit more often that we can kind of scan and like look for updates and like of known vulnerabilities. But pen tests kind of being on the more expensive and more in-depth option tend to be, I would say, probably, yearly is the average one if a company wants to have any sort of certain certifications or compliance reasons, like you were mentioning with audits as well. Eric, with your experience, are you seeing a lot of the companies that you're working with go sort of on the annual biannual basis?
Yeah, so what we're starting to see is the more of a trend where organizations will kind of couple both together. And so what's tending to start happening now is organizations will sign up for 4 quarterly assessments. And you do one external and internal penetration test on Q1. Then Q2, they would do a vulnerability scan. And they consider this more of like a remediation health check to kind of like make sure whatever was found during that Q1 assessment is now starting to get buttoned up, cleaned up, remediations are going the right direction. You know, any new vulnerabilities that may exist, they can kind of go ahead and address and highlight. And then Q3, they maybe do another full pen test because at that point they can go ahead and get like, okay, we got all these checks in place, we dialed in our controls. Let's see now how it works. Are there any new? And then at that point, you do that full assessment. And then from there, the Q4 would be another vulnerability scan, essentially giving them more of a health check and remediation as well to kind of dial it in. We've been seeing a lot more of that happening. Some organizations are still on the annual basis of doing just one pen test a year. The problem we find with that is a lot of the times, depending on how mature the partner is, they may have a pen test that looks like a Bible, you know, that they've been given. And then they're trying to develop this remediation plan and get overwhelmed. Like, I mean, you guys see it all the time. You manage networks. I was in the military, I was a maintenance guy, and we always joked around like maintenance is like air, you know, like nobody appreciates you until you don't have it, you know? So it's the same thing here, where it's like you have this huge amount of information that you're trying to digest and like to try to remediate everything and put a plan together. All of a sudden, you're 6 months down the road and you're still putting the plan together. Then you turn around and do your next annual pen test a year later, and the report looks just about the exact same. You know, you might have implemented a couple new controls, but still all that still sits there. So it's a lot harder for people to digest. Which is why, you know, pen testing as a service is becoming a lot more appropriate these days, where you can take monthly pieces of each network, digest them, put them in a plan, and then you can work on just focusing your efforts in one aspect of your network each month. And then that starts to help you put those remediations in place a lot quicker.
Because yeah, that's one big thing as well, right? So at the end of testing, we have, like you said, if we have a big stack of papers of hey, things we need to fix, that takes time, resources away, because most likely the IT team still has other issues that other employees are having, so they're helping out with that, but kind of needing to work on these important fixes, right? For security compliance and just buttoning up everything. Some of it might even come at the aspect of, hey, we need to update some end of life equipment. You had mentioned, you know, old switches or, you know, potentially like a firewall that's end of life, and that just for some reason wasn't caught. And so having to, I guess for a business as well, to be able to save up and just pay for those costs and for those devices to be set up and then implemented securely to the network. Because the life of IT is, okay, we could have a device, but it's not immediately, we can't immediately plug it in and have it working out. There's always some sort of configuration that we have to sort of like put onto the connection. So it will take time essentially to do those fixes. And like you're saying, it's good to, I guess, do that switching on and off between the two, just to like kind of cover your bases.
Right. And I mean, for those organizations that are very serious about it and passionate about their network, they take their remediations very, you know, maturely. They look at them, they go ahead and put a plan together. They try to do the 30, 60, 90 days versus critical high mediums. And they're going to try to get everything as cleaned up as much as possible. Our goal from an assessment perspective is we try to provide them what's actionable at the time, right? So the goal is, hey, here's a list of like 2,000 vulnerabilities, but out of these, maybe 10 or 15 of them are actually usable against you because there's a proof of concepts that exist. So the goal is to take and cut that all down to show them what can be hurtful and what's not. And then after that, it's like once you've dialed in on these and you got this fixed, Then we start looking at the other 1,990, vulnerabilities on there that you can start patching for due diligence side of it. But we see a lot of the times from the vulnerability scanning side and organizations, as Alan said, a lot of people do this for compliance needs. But one of the interesting pieces, and my partner James always jokingly says this the best, is like whenever we look at any company, like, yeah, but we're compliant, so we're secure. Compliancy does not mean you're secure. Just following the basic recommendations for compliancy is just, that's all it is. It's like just a layer of security, but it's not enough to say you're secure at this point, right? I mean, if you look at the NIST guidelines still, I think is it still 8-character password?
It is, yeah.
Yeah, I think
Which
so.
is quite scary that anybody would follow that still today with the new AWS password cracking rigs and anything else out there that can easily compromise anybody's account if you got access to it. So it's just important to realize that it takes a lot to dial in on your security, and every step we take in that direction towards security is like 10 steps away from convenience. So people just have to accept that and kind of live with it.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, because there's kind of so much that goes into it, and that we're kind of taken away, and convenience as well. We were discussing that, I think, a few days ago, of where it may bring away some convenience of logins and things like that, but security is paramount to businesses, because a security incident essentially can just totally destroy a business.
Yeah, if nothing else, exactly. That one point where you don't want to be down and have your business disrupted, forgetting even about all the security, but the security is obviously very important. And just going along with a little bit of some of the findings that are sometimes found are things that you wouldn't necessarily know, like, for example, an open port on some phone system device, for example, or a vulnerable network protocol in the alarm system, something that's on the network, things, again, beyond Windows updates, and things that come up in the results reports from the Vuln scanning and the pen testing.
Johnny, you were talking about the vulnerability scans, and I know a lot of our conversation has a little bit more on the penetration test, but just sort of a high level view, if you don't mind, just of what does a vulnerability scan look like, since they do seem to be a little bit more lightweight, but still an important aspect of like these tests.
So as I mentioned before, continuous vulnerability scanning is kind of the way that we're advising our clients on doing vulnerability scans, and kind of going away from the quarterly or monthly scans, just because there's so many new vulnerabilities that come out each day, that having those continuous results really improve the remediation aspect of things. So from a high level, there's going to be a primary server that's going to collect all the results. And then agents are installed on all of your devices, your laptops and desktops. And then those are continually updated with vulnerabilities that are found in general. And then each of those systems are swept for any of those vulnerabilities. And it's going to be on, it'll be Windows systems themselves. It'll be third-party software. It'll be the hardware itself as well. And then once that's all compiled and set up, then normally there would be a back-end remediation team. And then what they'll do is they'll go through those vulnerabilities that are found, starting with critical and high, and then go ahead and start the remediation efforts. So a lot of times it might just be patching or closing ports, but in some instances it's depreciated software. A big thing was when Adobe Flash got end of life. And there's still systems running Adobe Flash, and they weren't being updated any longer. So it was an actual uninstall of that software or replacing that product with another one. So scanning, discovery, remediation are the three big aspects of scanning.
And like you were saying, since it's kind of run on pretty much as many systems as we can on the network, we're covering a wide range, but it's also done in a way where we don't want to impact anyone's work. So yes, the goal is to not have us visible at all, or have anyone notice that we're there, testing at a low processing level. So yeah, right, we can find things.
Yeah.
It also happens internally and externally, scanning from your external public facing side as well. Are there any vulnerabilities?
Correct. Yeah. And the agents are very lightweight. So users never notice the scanning that's being done. And again, unlike pen testing, where you're going fully into the possibilities of exploiting those vulnerabilities, vulnerability scanning is just looking for the possible entryways. So there's no actual work, for lack of a better term, being done on those vulnerabilities. They're just being documented for remediation.
So if we were now to go into the high level view of a pen test, Eric, can you give us just the idea or just the general setup of what a pen test would look like kind of from start to finish, even like before the test even started, like the prep and then the remediation at the end?
Yeah, so penetration test itself, it's going to target a specific system, right? So either it's going to be a web application, it's going to be a wireless network, it's going to be an internal, external. Each one of the setups is a little bit different on getting it off the ground and running. But let's just go from an internal perspective. So for us, what we do is we'll send a device or a virtual machine and have them connect that to the internal network. The goal there is to use that as what we call the breach position, right? So essentially, we're mimicking if somebody was able to gain unauthorized access to an internal network, at that point, what could they do, right? So plugging in a device, using that to scan across the network, we do that vulnerability scan, look for all those vulnerabilities that may be able to be leveraged. And then on top of that, we start looking for normal kill chain, normal techniques that we can leverage within issues in Active Directory, issues within vulnerable network protocols, things like that that we can possibly leverage to get a quick win. If we can get on a device as quietly as possible, get a level set of permissions, and then from there, how far does the house of cards fall, right? And then what it looks like at the end of it, once we're done with the assessment, we provide back a report. The report itself is kind of gives an overview, like a high level, explaining to the C-suite, hey, these are your issues that you have from severities, like using the CVSS score, it'll tie down from critical to low. And then that kind of gives you an understanding of if it's critical, you should probably address this immediately. If this is high, you have within this amount of time, you should address this, medium, so on and so on. And then we also provide a technical walkthrough pretty much of the vulnerabilities as we do that to prove, one, there's evidence to show, hey, this isn't a false positive, We're not just someone who did a vulnerability scan, saw that you have the remote desktop man in the middle attack and decided to highlight this because it's really not going to take much advantage on you at this point. But these are the ones like your ADCS controller has a number of like ESC1 through 8, vulnerabilities that exist. And now this can allow a privilege escalation on your domain users to compromise your domain in this manner, right? You had your CrowdStrike simulation, your CrowdStrike enabled, but for some reason it didn't alert you to the fact that you had credential harvesting or dumping on your network, and it should have self-isolated the host, or at least in the minimum gave you an alert that somebody was doing this to that machine. So it's going to give you a great understanding of a number of those things that exist there. And then once you get the report, our goal is you take a week, you digest that information, then we sit down and have a closeout call, discuss it, kind of like walk through those high-level overview of the report, make sure that you understand exactly what was found, and then what the road path to remediation looks like.
Yeah, and then so overall, what is a rough timeline for like an average test that could run for a pen test?
It depends on the size of a company, right? I mean, that can go from ranging of a couple of weeks to a month or so. Depends on how big we're talking about of a network wise. But for an average, I'd say usually roughly 2 weeks for us.
Okay. And then Johnny, with the vulnerability scans, about how often you said that it was almost continuous?
Yeah, so nowadays we're running continuous scans. So it's just an ongoing effort. I'd typically say about a month for remediation. So as we kind of
Yeah.
get those results back and our team works on it, depending on how many vulnerabilities are found, that could differ in the timeline of remediation. But those scans are outputting daily. So
Okay. Yeah. So it's like one of those things of where it's that constant information, as long as the team is kind of working toward getting those resolution papers, that information, getting those resolved, that's the key, of course, to making sure everything is working as intended, because we can go ahead and we can test for everything. We can be aware, but we need to actually have the remediations done in the end to put those in place and fix those holes?
I would just say the kind of the thinking of doing pen tests and vulnerability scans, and not just for the sake of checking a box or meeting some requirement. And I think, as Eric had mentioned, being in compliance is great, but that's not the end all be all. I think you need to consider the benefits towards protecting the environment better. Also, you're checking your tools that you have in place for security. And I think the big highlight is, and I think it was mentioned either by Alan or Eric, is your reputation as a company itself, and protecting that. Because we're not just talking about data being secured. It's the entire reputation of that company. I mean, you could look back at other, larger companies that were affected, PayPal, LinkedIn, LastPass, et cetera. It really sticks in the minds of your partners and clients when something like that happens. So you want overall protection, not really just because you have to do it, but because there's a need to do it.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. I think that a lot of companies out there, I think we're starting to see on the rise because of cybersecurity and the cybersecurity questionnaires inside of there saying, or not, excuse me, cyber insurance. A lot of these cyber insurance, policies are, do you do penetration testing? Do you do risk assessments, things like that, that are a lot of the driving factors nowadays for most organizations to want to push for this. But in their mind, they want to spend the cheapest option possible. Like I got on the phone call with someone just a couple of weeks ago. He's like, now I have two questions. What would it be if I was able to, the bare minimum, what would that look like for you? And it's like, okay, I guess you're automatically, you just want to check the box and make sure you did this kind of thing. Like the goal here is really, you need to look at this as though it's an important aspect of your network that you're taking the advantage of understanding what vulnerability exists and how you can improve it. If you're looking at it like I had it done, I had a scan, here it is, and like you're not actually passionate about wanting to fix it, then you're just going to continue to be one of the problems where you're going to keep getting attacked, or you're going to be, waiting for the next ransomware that's going to take advantage of you, and your client's data and everything else is going to be leaked to the world, because you couldn't pay the ransom up front. So yeah, it's definitely important to pay attention to a lot of this, whether you do the vulnerability scanning or the penetration testing together. Essentially in my mind, when you look at the vulnerability scanning, it kind of only looks at one aspect of your network. And when you look at that and you see a clean bill of health, it kind of might give you a false sense of security. So you need to also understand, like, you're not going to be waiting for someone to bust through your firewall and get into your internal network because they gained access to one of your services that you had some faulty code on. It's most likely going to come from a phish, or someone giving away their credentials, or a breached database that held, someone's reused password over and over again, right? And now that they dive into your internal network, and the real question is, what are they going to do when they get in there? What can they find? How can they move around? Those are the things you're not going to find from that scan. So the pen test is valuable as well.
Yeah, and I think, just to piggyback off that, for me, a vulnerability scan is more maintenance. It is security, but it's really more maintenance.
Yeah.
For in preparation of a pen test, so that we're not, teams are not wading through so many of the findings on a pen test if you're not doing vulnerability scans, because everything's going to come up. You're going to solve and mitigate a ton of risks that are found, but really it's not going to be the most critical. So if you have your network as tip top as you can be, when you do that pen test, you're going to find, I know for Eric's team, they always find something, no matter how, how clean we get things going. There's always something, because they're using different tools than we're using. There's different things that come up. They're using different mechanisms to scan networks. So vulnerability testing is really the maintenance for that pen test, and then you can concentrate on really the more critical findings.
That's also a really good point to bring to like understanding for most organizations that are doing this, who are shopping around. Like when you start thinking about, like, I'm going to purchase, a pen test and also an MSP or an MSSP, like, they manage your network. Do you want them also testing your controls, right? Is it better to have like that third party separation so there's no biasness? Like, I'm not walking in there and I'm a Cisco product shop and you got some Palo Altos. And I'm like, these are garbage. You got to buy our stuff, kind of thing. Like, or, I've been managing your network for 8 years and you're clean bill of health. But then if you actually get someone in there who kind of looks past that knowledge point, who can start noticing the things that are actually problematic, sometimes you find out that MSPs might have a little bit hard time, like, yeah, we mess this up, you know, we don't want to look incompetent or so on, you know. So I think it's great to have that separation of duties, right? Making sure that when you're doing your assessments, you have an MSP and someone who's like a third party non-biased, going to go in there and just review it and, you know, throw the book at it and determine exactly what else is there. And in those scenarios, what ends up happening is the assessor and the MSP is like a dual-edged sword, right? They both get sharpened, you know, because we're working with them. They develop another level set of knowledge that now they can push across their entire platform of all their customers. Like John and I have been doing this for what, 7, 8 years now. You know, we've learned from each other over those years together. So it's like watching an entire fleet of people mature instead of just in a single instance. So it's nice to see it.
Yeah, and I think that that's one of those things too. Of we've talked about some businesses that might have misconceptions about what testing is. Of essentially, if flaws are found, that's kind of a good thing because that means that the tester did like enough testing to find something that we can go ahead and fix. We don't, of course, in the perfect world, if your security is tip top and awesome, then there's nothing wrong with it. But if you can find those cracks, then for sure enough testing has been done so we can get those fixes in place and we're all making each other better. Some other misconceptions we might have are companies might say, oh, well, I have an antivirus and I have a firewall, so there's not really a need for anything else. But there's so many other parts and aspects, like even let's see, trying to compromise like users, right? Because Eric, I think you had tried to do some social engineering in the past, or trying to get into any sort of like user data or try to find information on users, particularly to attempt to do compromises and things like that too.
Yeah, social engineering is a huge factor of pen testing, right? So on itself, when we look at it, organizations and education on employees is probably the worst out there, right? Because users, and it's probably the most overplayed saying there is in the IT industry, but users are the weakest link. And unfortunately, it's still true today, right? Because you have a computer that's binary, ones and zeros, right? You can't change it with emotion. It is what it is. Like, you're not going to just like sit there and tell it a nice story and eventually it's going to think you're a great guy and it's going to do what you want it to. It's 1 or 0. It's just going to be the binary it is. But with a person, they have emotion. They can be fooled, they can be tricked. You can do a number of different things. And on any given day, you can probably trick even the best of us, right? It's unfortunately complacency is the biggest one. And I used to say this all the time for everybody, and to like make sense for most organizations. I was in the military, did 2 tours in Afghanistan, and when we stopped getting bombed or shot at for like 2 weeks, people started to forget where they put their weapons, right? So if you're sitting in your office and you have 0 educational practices and policies in place where you're trying to continue to educate your employees, what ends up happening is complacency kicks in. 3 weeks later, all of a sudden they're clicking links, they're doing the wrong stuff, they're falling victim to all kinds of scams, so you have to have that constant education to keep them at bay. So that's why social engineering is very effective, because we can provide that controlled test, just like a pen test, to help them understand what users are problematic, what users are not paying attention, and then they can start to develop their plans around that. Or, yeah, we definitely have a problem with people in smishing or vishing or phishing, all the ishings that are out there today, right? So it's really good to couple all of that together when you're thinking about pen testing, because there are many avenues to get into a network, but the users are probably the easiest route.
For sure. Thanks for the insight on that. And then, Alan, I want to give you a chance too, if you had anything just before we kind of jump into the Q&A portion.
Well, I guess I would just reiterate with the penetration testing, the reports and the delivery and the importance of that on top of the Vuln scanning is the pen test tells a story, right, of what exploits were successfully exploited, what kind of lateral movement occurred, and that really leads to whatever recommendations are appropriate. It's network segmentation, maybe a better password policy, maybe a SIEM system. And I think the way John described it was perfect, where the vulnerability scanning is really like maintenance, and the penetration testing is, its own thing.
So let's go ahead. Let's jump into some of the questions. So one of them would be, I guess, if we had an example of one of the more common vulnerabilities that businesses potentially overlook.
Yeah, so I think the biggest one is the misappropriation of user privileges, right? And so I've seen so many times where, you have a overwhelmed IT staff getting tired of calls to the help desk because users want to install some kind of software or they want to get something set up. So they decide to just give every user local administrator access to their computer for some reason. And, obviously this is a very, very bad idea because now you just provided them the power to install malware, to run code, to execute software. Like you don't know where they're going. So the nice part about those authenticated vulnerability scans, you can kind of see those vulnerable softwares that are being installed on people's machines. You can go back and through that, but the goal would be really to minimize like what permissions they're allowed, like the least privilege model, only have the necessary permissions to perform daily operations. Going back to that story about the receptionist, she shouldn't have been able to compromise networks and go down the path of lateral movement or escalate permissions in any possible way. So the goal would be to really look at user permissions on the network. And I think that's one of the biggest pieces that's overlooked on most organizations.
Yeah, what I see, I think overlooked as well is the importance and the lack of multi-factor authentication that some businesses don't seem to see the need or importance of that, and also using software versions past their manufacturer's end of life date. We really need this QuickBooks 2017 machine, and these things are vulnerabilities, right? So I think what I see, those kind of things get overlooked a lot until they're pointed out to the business.
Yeah, definitely can see that as a common attack vector there. So, how do this next question here? How do attackers typically breach small businesses? Does anyone have any insight on that other than like user accounts? Like, how are small businesses that are kind of like just starting out typically breached?
I'll answer.
Go ahead,
just
John.
So from our purview as an MSP, the biggest one that we see is phishing attacks. So again, to Eric's point, users are something that we can't directly control, which is why we advise on campaigns, regular campaigns for security training and phishing testing to kind of educate the users, and then also check on which users may be most vulnerable to those attempts. That way they can get added training given, or security can be kind of molded around their process to better secure it. But yeah, from the MSP side, the biggest one that we normally see is a phishing attempt or some kind of compromise because of that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. Or, one of the more prevalent attacks that are occurring that's actually reaching its way up there as being as just as effective as phishing is password reuse, right? Organizations like LinkedIn, Twitter, all these places have unfortunately experienced a breach in the past, and the database of users was leaked, and attackers gained access to their passwords. And one thing we all know is people hate passwords, right? They just don't want to sit there and create a brand new password for everything. So they went home last night and they're like, I created this beautiful, perfect password. I'm going to change everything to it because I love it, and now I can remember it. It's just simple, right? So whenever that password's breached or leaked, at that point, people start to gain access to a number of different tools and aspects. I think when with a TeamViewer, the whole access when LinkedIn finally hit the dark web, all those passwords were leaked. The attackers went on the TeamViewer and started actually logging into people's accounts and gaining access to their actual their remote desktops and their computers that are available from a remote control perspective. And I think at that time, TeamViewer got accused of having a vulnerability because so many people were getting hacked because of this, right? And it was just because of the password reuse. So that password needs to be changed. Password management vaults need to be utilized. The two-factor authentication. I mean, we're 21st century at this point, guys. We have all these things in place. Definitely two-factor authentication is not like I think I'll get to it next week kind of thing. It should be a now kind of thing, right? We need to make sure this happens. So there's so many people, and unfortunately, small businesses getting off the ground, starting up, they're already in the red, trying to, meet their first year's end, trying to actually gain to a profit. So it's a very hard conversation to start adding in security controls and everything else. So they remain vulnerable constantly. And
Yeah, it is almost always the user who, one way or another, opens the door and lets something in. And then once it's in, that's where it takes over and tries to exploit all the vulnerabilities that we're talking about. But 90 something percent of the time, it's right through phishing or some kind of way it got in through a user, a human. Yeah.
All right. Yeah. And so going off from one of these last questions here that we do have. So are there any like red flags as well to tell if business is compromised or something that they might see or might notice?
Yeah. I mean, with as far as normal monitoring and keeping an eye on things, if there are excessive connection attempts to the network or unusual network traffic, login irregularities, possibly unexplained software installations or user accounts, anything like that pops up, those are definitely red flags. Outlook rules being created, into the RSS feeds folder was one of those typical ones. Um, Things like that are indicators of potential compromise.
Yeah,
yeah,
because I was going to say we also do have like account lockouts that can happen, right? If there's a additional suddenly increase in traffic, let's say we're monitoring a firewall where we can kind of over time see any sort of data that's let's say being sent out that that there's not an external backup and somehow we're seeing a lot of data being sent out that shouldn't be. Also, if I mean, an easy one with crypto attacks, if files start to show up as a weird file type or we don't really know what's going on and people can't open files anymore, too. A couple different ways.
Yep.
Yeah, the other thing is like whenever you're on your machine, a lot of the times you have your own antivirus that's sitting there. And if you're starting to see these pop-ups saying they're blocking this, is blocking that, it's probably a good indicator that you should probably be sending that to your IT. Because that means somebody's trying to probably, install some kind of a malware or accidentally clicked a link and it went to some JavaScript code that's now like downloading it from a malicious website. And you want to make sure that you're looking at that and taking it appropriately. Every time we talk about any kind of instance within like cybersecurity events or so on, we call it like it's like TSA. You treat it like at the airport. You see something, you say something, because the quicker you tell your IT team, the quicker they can start to respond and maybe at least destroy the threat as soon as possible. Kind of like so before it starts to spread like a wildfire.
Well, thanks, everyone. That's the last of the questions that we do have here today, as we're kind of buttoning up really close to our ending time as well. Hopefully this was filled with a lot of information that business owners can kind of take over and make some decisions, or just give a little bit of insight of some questions that they might be asking themselves of if their current IT is doing the job that they should, and also can they show that there are other business partners out there that they take cybersecurity seriously. If you do have any additional questions and you're not a current client at Fairdinkum, you can reach us at fairdinkum.com and we have a contact us page as well. And if you are a client at Fairdinkum, you can always reach out to your account manager and we're more than happy to give you as much info as possible on that and try to set up a call or meeting to discuss more with you. But I'd like to say thanks to the panel here, Eric from Hacket Cyber, Alan, and John from Fairdinkum here for joining and giving some info.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
All right. Have a good one, guys.